Hi everyone, I'm Dana from Project Arc, and if you have listened to us over the past couple of months, you know exactly what I'm going to say, or at least close to what I'm going to say over the next couple of minutes. But most of you probably know me from my work in pushing project-based learning into more of an authentic space so that our learners have that opportunity to affect real change in their world. And in fact, Project Arc, the ARC part stands for authenticity, relevancy, and community connected learning. And so for the past 20 years, this work has really been my passion, and the journey has mostly been rewarding, but it's definitely been bumpy at times. So this past November, I was reading a book that kind of struck a nerve with me. And so I put out a call on LinkedIn to connect with me if you considered yourself to be a disagreeable person in the education space. And this post was prompted by a quote from Adam Grant's New York Times bestseller, Think Again, The Power of Knowing What You Don't Know. So I'm going to read directly from that quote from the book here so that I don't get it wrong. But it says the ideal members of a challenge network are disagreeable because they're fearless about questioning the way things have always been done and holding us accountable for thinking again. There's evidence that disagreeable people speak up more frequently, especially when leaders aren't receptive, and foster more task conflict. They give the critical feedback we may not want to hear, but need to hear. So immediately, my headspace goes to education. And I thought, I've got to find some more disagreeable people out there. And I wasn't exactly sure where this would go in terms of when I put the call out for disagreeable people to respond to me. And I had quite a few. And so Tim and I were talking and said, all right, what can we do? Before the pandemic hit, we were planning on an in-person conference that never happened because of the pandemic. We shifted to an online space and we held these displaced conversations because we all felt displaced. But we didn't quite want to go back to that. And thus, DIST was born. So, our guests today, we don't have any idea what they're going to say as our conversation unfolds over the next 35 to 40 minutes. And we don't necessarily agree or disagree with them. But Tim and I really want to have these conversations so that we can learn and grow as educators as we interact with all of you. And on that note, I'm going to turn things over to our awesome facilitator, Tim Kubik, because he's the master at this.
Well, thank you, Dana. And I want to welcome our guests today, Dr. Karun Patak, Tim Casperson, and Dagan Bernstein. I'm Tim Kubik. I'm Dana's partner at Project Arc, on a similar arc and journey with her. Started out separately, but we met several over a decade ago, shared a passion around authentic learning, and been working together on it. I want to start off by asking Dagan to kick us off with a brief introduction of yourself, and then what's your diss word that you want to throw out into this space?
Awesome. Thank you, Tim. Aloha, everyone. My name is Dagan Bernstein. I'm an educator based here in beautiful Hawaii, also known as Hawaii, the Hawaiian Island Archipelago. And I'm currently at a K-12 independent school in a little town called Waimea. And I work at our K-8 campus as the director of our capstone project program. So all the students at our school in grades 5, 8, and 12 complete an independent project focused around our school's Malama Kaia'ulu community sustainability model. So I work with over 60 students and about 6 to 8 teachers leading that program. And I'm also the president-elect of HISTE, which is a Hawaii nonprofit on technology and education. And the word that came to mind for me is I'm going to go with discomfort. I really love leaning into discomfort. I love how discomfort can help possibly shine light on some areas that could be worked on. For example, I love like provocative things like what if we just banned homework, or
Mm.
why do students have to take 7 subjects, for example, or just things like that. So I love those discomfortable, uncomfortable, discomforting ideas in education that could be windows into innovation. So I look forward to this conversation, and thanks for having me.
You're very welcome, and you've got a beautiful school. I actually did some work there about a decade ago. I recognized it as soon as you said Waimea. So I'm jealous, not just because you're in Hawaii, but because you are also at a beautiful school that does some really cool stuff. Going to turn it next to Karun. And Karun, share a little bit about yourself and what your D word is.
Sure. My name is Karun Pathak. I'm actually the founder and director of a small after-school program, after-school tutoring program, and it's an enhancement program as well. It's ranging from grade 5 to university fourth year. We try to prepare students to get into law and into medical school right after high school, which is a big thing that doesn't happen in the United States and Canada. Usually we have to do an undergraduate degree before we get into medicine or before we get into law, which is I found a little ridiculous because in the UK you can go right into medicine or law right after high school, fresh while you're still passionate about it. I guess I have 2 words because one's how I feel and one's what I want to do. What I feel is dismay. I'm absolutely taken aback about how disincentivized the students are from pursuing education or from even engaging with it at a deeper level. And what I want to do is dismantle this present system. So those are my 2 dis words, dismay and dismantle.
Well, I really like that bifurcation that you introduced here, right? There's a way for us to disagree with you on a couple of different levels as we're talking about it. So thank you for that, Karun. And fascinated by the program you're working on. I think in the United States, a lot of people forget this, but the reason we tend to do college before we do med school or law school has a lot to do with the Vietnam War and draft deferments and whatnot, because law school was a 1-year program until the Vietnam War. There's something to that we can
I know that
discuss
actually.
a little bit later. Yeah. Um,
Yeah.
and last but by no means least, because we share the same name, Tim, or at least some call us Tim, right? Introduce yourself, Tim, and tell us what your dis word is.
Oh, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Again, my name is Tim. I am a district curriculum supervisor here in beautiful northern New Jersey. And I work for CTE district, so it's grades 9 through 12. And we have upwards of 30 programs, probably pushing 40 now, that
Mm-hmm.
really range the gamut. We have everything from engineering to cosmetology, fashion design, landscape design, general building trades. So there's really a place for every type of student and pretty much every career path. My dis word is disconnect. Being a curriculum supervisor, there's often a disconnect between the things that we feel like we have to do and those things that we feel like are the right things to do. Um, and it can sometimes be challenging. And I'm lucky in the sense that I work for a district where we have a project schedule. So every Wednesday, the school's essentially shut down and we can do a lot of different explorations.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm lucky in that regard. But in working with my teachers in other districts, I realized that's not the case for everybody. So I feel like there's a disconnect there.
There definitely is a disconnect, and it's a conversation Dana and I have been having about one of the schools that we work with, where um, the school is on turnaround with their state board of education, right? Like they're not performing as expected according to all that stuff. They've been encouraged to experiment. We're helping them with some of these experiments and the kind of work that Dagan described and that you're doing, and the teachers still don't believe it. They don't like, as you said, they want to do this. They still have this feeling that the have tos are going to come out and pummel them.
Mm.
I want to weave back though this interesting split that Karun made, right? Between the word that is descriptive and the word that's more of a verb of what we want to do. I really like that move, Karun. I thought it was very smart. And I'm just sort of curious if Dagan or Tim, you want to pull on, you gave more descriptive words, but is there another dis word you want to throw out that's sort of what you would want to do? No pressure, but I just want to give you that opportunity so you can look as brilliant as Karun. Okay?
Well, I don't know if that's possible. Sounds like a pretty bright guy. I guess, I mean, it's a pretty synonymous word with what he said, but I did think of the word disassemble. I've been reading actually a lot about complexity theory over the past year, and I love this idea about how, when you take something apart, I mean, schools are so complex, right? They're these complex entities, districts, schools, even a given classroom can be very complex. And, we're trying to reimagine and fix these systems of education. But if you were to disassemble it into its pieces and start with first principles thinking and try and put it back together, I could almost guarantee you would never come up with a system that we have now. I mean, the way we operate is just layer upon layer of decisions that have been made that really don't make sense and are in a sense disconnected, to tie back to another word that was thrown out. So
Uh,
disassemble is one that kind of came to mind when Karun mentioned dismantle.
cool. And Tim?
Yeah, it came to my mind as well. You kind of took my word there a little bit, Dagan, but it'd be nice to dismiss, for another dis word, some of those mandates that, we in public education are subjected to. And when I first started my career as a teacher, my superintendent was one of I think he was the last tenured superintendent in the state.
Hmm.
And it was very liberating working underneath him because he did have the ability to just dismiss some of those things that were coming from above and really gave us freedom. I remember when I was going through my interview process, and he was the last step in the hiring process and said, "Look, you're a social studies teacher. Um, we're entering the internet age. The students have all this information at their fingertips. If we were to insert a microchip in their brain and they knew all the historical content you could think of, what would you teach them?" And that's what I want you to focus on in the classroom. So it was quite liberating there, teaching in that environment.
It certainly does sound that way. And I think both Dana and I had opportunities to do things like that a little bit in our own careers, which is part of why we became disagreeable. I'll just share that my last full-time teaching job in Denver, they put me down in the basement by the boiler room because I wouldn't bother anybody else with my outrageously wild class that was always having interesting discussions and doing things and making a lot of noise. And what they didn't realize is that there was a door out of the basement, out of the back of the building, that I could take my students outside of the building and go do cool things, and nobody ever noticed that we weren't in my classroom, right? So I mean, I like that uh, that notion that part of the challenge that we're all wrestling with here, disassembling, dismantling, dismissing, right? It's not just the parts of the system, but it's also maybe kind of an authority structure in our schools that's extremely top down, right? And isn't the only possible model for the way we do the work that we do. I'm curious if anybody would disagree with me on that question, on that idea that much of what we're pushing against uh, is a top-down authority structure, or if you have a slightly different take on that, feel free to jump in. And Karun, we haven't heard from you in a bit, so you can go first if you want, or you can pass and let someone else play.
No, I think you're absolutely correct. There is the top-down structure that we are dealing with, and then the major problems or the major sources of disagreement that I had with the system that's taken place in Ontario, especially in the province that I'm in. We have basically I guess you could say, a gatekeeping authority called the OCT, the Ontario College of Teachers, that doesn't allow anybody that hasn't gone into their validation process or their process of approval to teach. And mind you, you could have a PhD and 10 years of experience teaching, and they will not let you teach in Ontario. You could have people being shut out, passionate teachers being thrown around and having to go back to school to do their program and then having their accreditation process. And then for what reason? A friend of mine and I, we were starting a magazine called Potentia, an education-based magazine. And I reached out to the OCT and I asked them, hey, listen, what are your plans to integrate these passionate teachers who may not necessarily have your accreditation? What are your plans to help them get back in to address the massive burnout that's happening and the massive teacher shortages that are taking place in Ontario itself? Not only in Ontario, I'm assuming this is like a worldwide kind of phenomenon, right? And there was no response from them. And there was zero feedback. I don't even think any action is being taken place. So, yeah, Tim, I completely agree with you. A top-down is it is the problem, the authoritative structure that is built top-down. Yeah.
Anybody else
And
want to jump in on that?
I just wanted to echo what Karun was saying about as far as shortages go. I'm in the middle of the interview process right now, and used to have upwards of 100 applicants for a position, and the resumes are coming in few and far between, and luckily I'm getting a lot of really good qualified candidates. But and being in a CTE district, and one of the things you said that really resonated with me is we have so many niche programs, and New Jersey does have an alternate route process where if you have a certain amount of career experience, but the problem is it needs to align in a certain way in order to receive certification.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, we do have a qualified teacher in this program, but something as unique as aerospace engineering. Um, and it can be a real challenge. We can come up with programs all day long, but then finding the people that can get qualified to teach in those programs is a real challenge of ours.
Um, yeah, and it's sort of interesting to me when we think about this as it's a stretch, but as a dislocation from the teaching profession. Like we have a lot of people who are leaving, um, either as they're in their teacher prep programs because they're not satisfied with what they're getting. They don't feel like this is what they thought it was going to be like to be a teacher. Or, we know there's a classic drop-off rate around 7 years, right? That people do it for like 5 or 6, 7 years, and then they flake out. Um, and um, I'm wondering about what um, I'm wondering about where else we have gatekeepers that are causing that displacement or dislocation from people who are passionate about teaching. Um, and I want to throw out my dis word for tonight, which occurred as you all were talking, and that's distributed leadership. Because there was a conversation about a decade ago about really encouraging distributed leadership as a move to make in our schools. Um, I don't think it got much traction. I don't think it really took off. But what are we doing to keep teachers feeling like they have some sort of impact on the system rather than just serving as a delivery vehicle? Thoughts on that? Maybe we'll get some disagreement here as we consider those possibilities.
I think we're all thinking those are so you're going with the easy stuff here. Um, these are great questions. What a fabulous book I recently read is The Power of Giving Away Power.
Mm.
Really recommend that book if you're not familiar with it already. It talks about constellation thinking, versus pyramid thinking. Um, and God, it's such a it's a complicated complex question because I have worked under systems of distributed leadership, and I think it takes a highly skilled collaborator to and communicator to work effectively in that model. There's you can list the pros and cons of structures of hierarchy and distributed leadership models, and each do have validity to them. I don't want to kind of derail this idea too much, but I want to throw something out maybe that's a little bit more provocative because as we were kind of talking, I was also thinking about these top-down models that also exist within our classrooms.
Good.
I think often, as teachers, we love pointing the finger up. And I say this as a classroom teacher, but sometimes we forget to point the fingers at ourselves. And how are we operating as teachers in our classroom that are perpetuating these narratives of control to our learners? And I think that was one thing. That was kind of my aha moment when I hit my kind of like 4 or 5 year mark as a teacher, where I started to get frustrated with we talk about impact, right? We all want to have impact. And when I really rethought the dynamics and paradigms in my classroom, and a lot of that came from my work with these capstone projects in which students are asked to carry a lot more of the cognitive load. My role is more of a mentor and coach,
Mhm.
and they are engaging with, asking deep questions, doing the research, coming up with ideas, reaching out to outside resources and whatnot. And once I started really kind of flipping that, paradigm and empowering the students to give feedback to each other, to design rubrics, to self-assess and self-grade them, I started to feel this energy emerge in my learning space, right? So that's kind of one, I think, small impact that teachers can have in their classroom if they're feeling frustrated with these top-down models is maybe look at your own classroom and ask yourself if you're perpetuating some of those power structures in how you lead your classroom. So hopefully that kind of all works into this idea of structures and power that exist in our schools.
I think it
That
definitely
actually was a
does.
fantastic.
Go ahead, Corinne.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No,
No,
you
I
go
think that
ahead.
was a fantastic. Yeah, that was a fantastic point made by Dagon. The narrative of control has always been something that I've disagreed with, and as a philosopher, that's where my PhD is in moral psychology, Kantian moral psychology, just to be clear. He's very much a rigorist, and he really tried to, uproot the traditional thinking system. And in my classes when I was a professor of philosophy at the University of Bristol, University of West of England, Humber College, and University of Guelph Humber, my whole thing was placing the onus of learning on the student. Not for me as much as a teacher, but just dropping a few sparks here and there for them to really begin questioning their own reality. And I think that may be a little bit easier with philosophical topics. I can ask you if you really are a good person, prove it to me. I can prove that you're not a good person, and then throw the ring of Gaijis at them, or something along those lines,
Oh,
and really get them stirred up. And I think in at the university level and perhaps at the higher secondary levels, that works well. But at the lower levels, somewhere between elementary and the middle school levels, that isn't as an effective technique. And even placing that kind of, even if you do get across to the student and you do spark that light in them, I see a huge amount of reluctance just to want to say something, or even if they feel like there's something to say or something to add or an age thing. I'm not sure if this is a level thing. I'm not sure if this is a student to difference based on just how they are at what their disposition is or what their inclinations are as a student.
mhm.
But I've seen that when you do kind of destroy the regular teaching narrative, the regular narrative of control, and you kind of sit back and give the control, at least to the older students, they start taking at the opportunity. They start jumping in and wanting to contribute and say things and test you. And I feel like that has been the most effective for me, especially in the university and the higher secondary levels. So thank you for that point.
No, I think it is a great point. I also think there's been a report that's been getting a lot of attention. We mentioned it in our newsletter this past week. It was featured in the Atlantic that basically shows like younger elementary kids love school, think they're learning from it, and then by about fourth or fifth grade, down it goes until it gets to like the 20 and 30% rate in the higher grades, right? And kids hate school and they don't think they're learning anything from it anymore. Tim, I see you nodding. Anything you want to take off in that direction related to the comments we've had about the control of students?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to go back to the point of that you had made earlier. I think it was you, Tim, with burnout. And one of the things I think gets lost is when when the teachers come into the profession, and I used to adjunct at the college level, and I worked in a teacher prep program for, I believe, 12 years. And one of the things that always perplexed me is, we're preparing these teachers for a profession, and their first real exposure to it is in their senior year. And a lot of them get kind of turned off to the thought of teaching. It's their first experience, and they're like, "Wow, I just spent 4 years in my undergrad, and here I am, and I just learned that this profession really isn't what I thought it was going to be." And then you add on top of it things like, duties and bus duty and different clubs. And it seems like the newer folks that come in, um, you know, usually take on things like student council, class council,
Mhm.
all those extras that really add to the layer of stress and burnout. And retention is something that we've given a lot of effort to in my district, and we've been luckily pretty successful, I believe, with it. We've lost a couple of good folks along the way, but but to me, that's a real challenge across the board. And to go back, Karun, to what you were saying, in Ontario, we're facing the same problems here as far as the applicant pool and the retention and then as far as control in the classroom, my district was built on the philosophy of teacher empowerment.
Mhm.
And so the teachers have a lot of flexibility and ability to create things. And Dr. Lauer, I know when you visited our district, I think you met one of our teachers who got his hands on one of the first VR sets, the Oculus, and developed a whole project where his students developed a virtual Ellis Island. And they did all the 3D modeling, and it was a gameplay. And it was really eye-opening to see the students give their feedback and say, not only are we presenting to the administration at Ellis Island and gathering that authentic feedback, so it's like real world, they're presenting in the boardroom at Ellis Island, but they started to really see the application of their content areas. I remember one student in particular, the first thing he did when he got to Ellis Island was started taking pictures of a tile wall. And I asked him, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I don't think I have the physics quite right in the light reflective properties in the modeling." And he had said, "This is the first time I'm really getting excited about physics." And it was a really, something that really out of my career has really stuck out. But with teacher empowerment came, well, as the teacher in the classroom, I need to pursue those things. And if I'm going to get a field trip, I'm organizing that field trip. I'm doing all the legwork. I'm doing the approval. So um, oftentimes that in and of itself was a challenge just because it was, where am I going to find the time to do this? I don't know if that really answers it, but
I think it does. It offers some nice examples, and I think it gets, I mean, so here's the question I wanted to say I think it was to Dagan earlier. about are we responsible, right? I hear this so often from teachers that I work with now, and it really makes me sad. But like, well, we can't do any of that stuff with our students now. After the pandemic, they're feral, right? They're like addicted to their cell phones. They have no social skills. They're wild animals, right? If we turn them loose like that. And I've sometimes said to those teachers, you think they're really feral, or do you think they just became independent? Anyone want to grapple onto that?
Well, I think it's more of a an issue of if you have the world's answers to every single question in the palm of your hand, why should I be sitting in school? Kind of attitude that's coming out from these students. They feel like that there's no question that ChatGPT or Gemini or one of these artificial intelligence can answer. There's no code that cannot be written by them. There's no, um, again, everything that I need to know in school, I could just ask my phone. So why am I sitting here learning about it when
Mhm.
eventually Elon Musk or one of his people is going to invent a brain chip where they can upload this information to me or something to that effect.
Yeah, and
I've had
my oldest kid is totally ready for that chip, right? Like
a
he has said very clearly, when that chip is ready, I'm downloading it because I want to know everything. And I'm like, you never know what kind of code is going to be in there. But it goes back to the comment that Tim made when he introduced himself about, or I think it was when you introduced yourself, about having a superintendent that basically said, you know, kids are going to have access to all the information. What do you want to teach them, right? Um, do we have the freedom in our system right now to act that way? To say, Karun, you've got a point. Kids have access to everything, right? When cell phones first showed up in my classroom, I was thrilled, right? Because the first thing I did is say, I don't know the answer to that. Look it up on your phone, right? Like, and the kids would, right? And they'd race to see who could find the answer first, right? So, like, but do we have the freedom to do that, or are we so constrained by the system and what we feel as educators we have to do, that we're uh, sort of, well, I'm just going to go here because Karun, you said you were a philosopher. So are we put in a situation of moral distress, right? Where we know what we should be doing, we know who our kids are, right? What they need. But our entire system of evaluation is more along what are we delivering? Are we adhering to district expectations and that kind of stuff? And is it burnout that teachers are experiencing, or is it just literally saying, I don't want to be a career when I can't use my professional judgment?
Are we really teaching them to think? That's one of the things that has been running around in my mind. Yeah, sure, we can deliver content to them. Yeah, sure, we can inundate them with facts, statistics, and all these philosophers' quotes and their theories. But are we really teaching them to think anymore?
Hmm.
I don't think that that's happening, and I think that's one of the reasons that you know, um, teachers are experiencing a burnout because it's not about them getting excited to teach. It's not about them pulling the curiosity out of the student anymore. It's about doing the agenda, delivering the content, and then testing for the content.
Yeah, and I'm glad you raised the word curiosity there because that's a word that's been very important in Dana's work, right? Is trying to figure out how to really connect with that learner curiosity. But as you were talking, Karun, it made me think of two other dis words that we haven't heard yet in our conversations. At least I've got my notes from all the other conversations before. I don't think we've heard them. Discretion and discernment, right? Which are dis words for how we think, right? Are we being discrete in our analysis, or are we just generalizing? Are we able to discern subtle differences, right? And in the rush to cover the curriculum, I think those words have just fallen out. Anybody want to disagree with that or build on it? Do we have time to think in our profession? Do our students have time to think in their learning? I see Karun shaking his head no.
I
And
think you're right again, Tim. I think discretion and discernment have been thrown right out the window. there is very little room to use your discretion in the classroom. I think that's one of the shortcomings. I feel like that again, this may make me sound much more disagreeable than the average person. It's probably why I started my own education business. But I had a lot of problems with the highly structured, you have to deliver A, B, C, and this is what you got to test for. And in my mind, I'm thinking, well, I can deliver this material, but are they actually going to retain it? Are they going to think about it? Is it going to affect their lives? Is it going to change how they operate? Is it something that's going to hit them in the heart versus something that's going to go in one ear and out the other? And I don't
Mhm.
believe that we have in this system, in the hierarchical system, in the top-down model any sort of discretion to operate in the way we wish to, especially if we see one thing is working better than the other.
Anybody else want to jump in and build on that?
I guess one thing that's coming to mind here in this discussion is, I guess, like disassociation. Again, if we're just going to keep on this dis theme,
Okay.
like you know, I have this wonderful opportunity to work in this really amazing program, this capstone program, and the way I often frame it in for myself is I think back to my schooling experience in which I could play the game with minimal effort. I could get high B's and low A's and just I could do it. But it wasn't very interesting to me. It was hard for me to find teachers that motivated me. And my main interest at that age really revolved around playing guitar, skateboarding, and playing basketball. Like those were the things that I was really interested in. And those were all things I did after school, right? I could play guitar for hours and, you know, teach myself songs from listening to them or going skateboarding with my friends, or we made skateboard videos using the old clunky VHS, shoulder recorders and whatnot. And how cool it would have been to have had the opportunity to do like a capstone project in which I could like make my own skateboard video or record my own song. And I see so much opportunity and inspiration in this space that we create for students. And, you know, it's hard sometimes to find students to really want and to be inspired to engage with the openness and the freedom that
Mhm.
these types of learning opportunities provide. And sometimes um, they're kind of like, well, can't you just, they almost would prefer like, can't you just give me a test, or why can't I just do
Right.
that regurgitation model? So there's this like a little bit of a dissonance there between the student that's like, school's so dumb, I wish I could just do what I wanted to do. And then when you say, okay, what do you want to do? They're like, well, just give me the test. Let's just get it over with. So it's like, it's this is kind of this push and pull we have, and there's like this art um, to the work we do as teachers, and that's why I always come back to relationships as being so important in the work we do, because I always look at that challenge of how am I building relationships with the students that I'm working with in my little cohort. Like I have a 10 student cohort of eighth graders that are that are part of my homeroom that I work with, and like really building those relationships to like unlock that project that's really going to get them to be curious, to ask deep questions, to be critical in their thinking, right? And to work hard. Like, I have one student this year who's really struggling because when the work gets hard, they hardly work.
Right.
They really push back as it gets hard. And I keep trying to tell them like, well, let's try and find another resource, or let's reach out to another person in the community around your topic. And they're like, well, no, I think this is good enough or whatnot. And so it's that sustained like drive for curiosity that it's so hard to unlock, even when we think we're creating conditions that would allow that to thrive.
Yeah, and to a certain extent, there's a fair amount of systemic conditioning that goes on there. It's why I always wonder why we wait. And I'm glad you're doing capstone projects in the middle school years, right? Rather than waiting until senior year, right? And for a lot of schools that I've seen do capstone projects in senior year, right? It's kind of like, well, they won't come to school otherwise, so we have to let them do this, right? Because they've got to have their seat time to graduate. They got to finish out that second semester, right? Um, but the students do, you're not wrong, struggle with that kind of independence and space for permission, right? When they've been controlled most of their lives. We're starting to head to the point where we'll disengage from the conversation here, and I'm totally open to hearing some summative thoughts from people of what your takeaways might be. If there's a diss word that you heard from somebody else you thought was really outstanding and is going to be your takeaway, or if you've listened to this now and say, well, this is just a bunch of idle discussion and it's not going anywhere, and I'm going to disagree with the whole premise of this conversation and go back to making a difference in my schools, we're open to that too. So, closing thoughts. What are we thinking? Or do you just want the test to see how many diss words that we did?
You teachers are great at wait time.
Well, I guess the closing thoughts is where do we go from here? How do we challenge the hierarchy or the top-down model? What do we do that's going to become effective both at an institutional level and in the classroom?
Hmm.
Something that we can get involved in. And I believe Project Arc was one of those things that resonated with me for this reason, because I feel like you guys have multiple prongs that are put into different areas of education, and that you guys are really trying to change the system from within, without, from the top, from the bottom. And it was one of the things that really resonated with me. So, are there any kind of hard and fast ways that we can, first of all, make students curious enough to take their learning to their own hands and sustain this curiosity through the intense years that they have to go through, especially the hormonal years, as I call them, through their teen years. And then when you do have that ability to sustain this curiosity, what kind of changes should we make when we see that things are working better in this model where we are able to have uh, curious students who want to take their learning into their own hands? How do we take that to the higher ups and actually make a difference and change on what I take system that not only gatekeeps but prevents institutional change from actually taking place because they're so afraid that they might lose control, or again, I sound very agreeable here, but I think that's the whole point.
Yes. Yeah. Um, Tim or Dagan, you want to tackle that? Not that we have to have an answer here, but what are some practical steps to uh, challenge the system and the institution in a way that will lead to some actual transformation? Because top down clearly isn't the answer, right? We don't go meet with superintendents, tell them everything they're doing is wrong, and they have to change it, and they have to push it down on their teachers, right? We saw those attempts with school reform in the uh, No Child Left Behind and the teens. It doesn't work. So thoughts. I mean, you've shared some of them already, but I'm just curious how you would summarize. Tim, you want to take a stab?
Yeah, it's I'm not gonna lie, it's a challenge. I think to your point earlier, really focusing in on the classroom level. And, when we hold our new teacher orientation, we spend an entire half day really stressing how do you incentivize the learning? And how do you get the students to buy in? Um, and it's a challenge at times, especially in a district like mine where, a lot of students are coming in intrinsically motivated and it's really interesting because you see them in their CTE area and how they can thrive. And then as a social studies teacher, you could see the challenge to really get them inspired. But to try to put put yourself in the mindset of the student. And, you know, I know what interests me as a history teacher. I know what interests me as an ELA teacher or whatever type of teacher it might be. I have a passion behind it, but how do I get the students to buy in? How do I get them passionate about it? And that's something we stress to our teachers to really take a step back and consider, regardless of the confines of the curriculum, how can you package it in a way where it can be incentivized?
Yeah, and I want to validate, Tim, what you just said there. I do think part of the solution to the challenge is empowered students who push against the system, right? Which makes me very disagreeable in education, because I'm talking about empowering wild animals, right? Is the common perception. But I do think that's a key part of it. And we often at Project Arc like to work most with lower grades and middle schools as a way of creating students who are change agents rippling through the system as they go, rather than working with high schools because people think, well, the kids are ready to handle this level of work and thinking, right? Like, let's use the kids as change agents and make them feel comfortable about that. Dagan, you're doing that kind of in Waimea. So thoughts about that as we wrap things up.
Yeah, no, this was a great conversation. It was really great to chat with you, Karun and Tim. Um, I mean, I really, I was thinking a lot about what Karun was talking about his work at the university level, and I hope that like the kids that I work with, like I think ahead when they're in university or in the job force or whatever, that they are those students who can think independently and can be those contributors in those spaces. And for all the challenges and the frustrations we have, maybe with them as fifth graders and as eighth graders, we're working through that process in an early stage. And, we very intentionally design, um, structures that help them wrestle with these new concepts and hopefully, in the long term can help them develop these kind of evergreen skills they'll need to thrive. So, I always love coming together with other educators that are doing interesting things and are working in either different parts of the world or in different age groups or in different structures. And you can kind of hear how, we're all wrestling with this similar challenge of working with a system that we know doesn't work. Um, and I just feel like all of us are kind of planting these seeds in different ways that hopefully, over we look at these time horizons of 10, 15, 25 years, will result in a world that kind of meets the moment
Mhm.
and can address these trend lines that we see kind of unfolding and evolving in front of us right now. Because it's hard work, it's frustrating work. But I always feel like when I have the opportunity to talk with other educators that are wrestling with similar problems, that it's refreshing to know that we're doing so with the best interests of young people in mind. And I think with that approach, um, we can have a positive impact.
It's certainly an optimistic perspective, right? And I want to build on that perspective as I wrap up. Then I'm going to turn it to Dana for the final word, right? You can take us out, Dana. Um, on a practical level, I think what we've found is that things work a lot better when you get people to invest in designing together rather than trying to plan for what's going to be best for them and try to get them to buy into it, right? We have done some work with various schools and districts where we work with teachers, students, and community partners in designing the learning experiences based on what students say they're interested in, the way it connects to the curriculum, that kind of stuff. And those conversations have been phenomenal, including cute little fifth graders who just blow everybody's socks out of the water. Like nobody can believe a fifth grader could be that thoughtful, that inspiring, that curious, etc. Right? And so that is a practical step that I would recommend and that we have facilitated in a lot of different places. Um, because I think it is something that administrators take a look at. And we were lucky enough in some of these workshops that the administrators were part of the conversation also. And they suddenly realized the assets they had in their community to really start thinking about learning differently. So I'd highly recommend that as a possibility, and to take the pressure off teachers of feeling like they have to plan perfectly and allowing them to design with instead of plan for, I think is a big first step to work on. But with that, I want to thank the three of you for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to Dana to take us out, which could include your
On
thoughts
the
on the whole conversation, because you've been
well,
remarkably quiet for Dana Lauer.
it's a bookend night for me. And I've just been enthralled with what everybody is saying. And so I'm going to start my closing on a very negative note, but then end in a positive way by using a dis word. And I honestly, I can't tell you if somebody said it in the course of tonight because I have so many notes, or if I wrote it down because it just came to my mind. But I'm going to use the word disappear. And
Okay.
so when I'm hearing the stories about, we've gone from 100 really great applicants to a much smaller number of applicants, or the fact, that teachers are leaving in year 5 to 7 and they're just disappearing from education. Obviously, a very, very negative connotation. But taking that word and thinking about it in a more positive way. So if we can get our teachers to disappear within the classroom, I think that we can have a shift in how the system works so
Mhm.
that it is not me, the teacher, from the top down perspective in the classroom, and I'm telling you what you need to know. But I'm so engaged with the learning that is happening and facilitating that process that it becomes a situation where I remember one time my superintendent walked into my classroom with a very important guest from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and she couldn't find me. She was just very, very distraught because where's Mrs. Lauer? Where's Mrs. Lauer? And I was laying on the floor, with a bunch of kids, and we're working on something. And how dare I disappear and not be at the front of the classroom? But if we can get teachers to really disappear within the learning that's happening in the classroom, I think that the system will start to shift from within, and maybe we can have more individuals that want to go into education or quit leaving education, and we can foster that curiosity that we want our learners to have, whether they're in pre-K or whether they're at the university level. And so as I close out tonight, all that discomfort and dismay and dismantling and disconnecting, I'm going to think about how can, in terms of the work maybe that we do at Project Arc, how do we also kind of disappear into the background and push that work forward?
All right. Well,
And on that,
that was a great closer, Dana. Um,
Fantastic, fantastic.
all right.
Yeah.
But thank you all so much for joining us. And this is my favorite part of the month, is to sit back and listen and learn. Because that's why I left the classroom. I remember having the conversation with my principal about 2 weeks into the year, and I said, "Make me want to stay, help me to grow." And when he said, "You're the best teacher I ever had," I said, "But that doesn't help me to grow." Because everybody was saying to me, "Dana, can you just please quit because you're making the rest of us look bad?" You know, but help me to learn and grow. And so this is by far my favorite part of the month, is when we record these sessions.